This is Comrade Brad. See this watch here? I bought this directly from Invicta. On sale last month for only $400. Does this look like one of those crappy styles of combat subs they sell on drop.com? I don't think so. This is the GL0249, the most combat-y glycine sub ever made. This ain't no tree-hugging GoldenEye. This is a man's watch with 12 and 24-hour Arabics, a metal effing bracelet, and this orange band running around the minute track that doesn't really do anything but looks really cool. With this combat sub, you are prepared for naval warfare in any submarine at any time. Do you got a problem with that? Go ahead. Make my day.
Glycine, the original maker of the combat sub, was bought out by Invicta in 2016. Invicta is referencing this watch as combat rather than combat sub. I think combat sounds a little stupid, so I'm stubbornly going to continue with Glycine's tradition of calling the watch the combat sub. About a year and a half ago, I purchased a post-Invicta buyout combat sub. I wore it for a few months and then sold it. It was model GL088, which was the rubber strap version of the watch I'm reviewing now, the GL0249. There's been a number of small changes made between the case of my old combat sub and the one I'm currently reviewing. In order to cut down on the length of this review, for the most part, I'm not going to discuss these changes. The combat sub has a super readable dial. The 12-hour markings are not applied, but they are thickly painted, making them look embossed when viewed up close. The dial is a basic, no-nonsense black. The handset and minute track are orange. The minute track divides each second into fifths, using shorter notches for fractions of a second and longer notches for each second. The orange color of the minute track actually obscures the minute track and makes it harder to read, but I still love the hell out of it as it looks so cool. The 24-hour markings below the 12-hour markings don't add clutter to the watch, though I would need reading glasses in order to see them. I would argue that Glycine's bastardized logo is taking up a little too much dial real estate. If Invicta hadn't put their dirty mitts on Glycine's logo, this probably wouldn't have bothered me. I would normally complain about the useless writing at the bottom portion of the dial, but I actually like it on the combat sub because the combat sub has a history behind it and it's earned its useless shit on the dial. The combat sub's date is an example of how to properly do dates in watches. The date is not microscopic and there is a lot of margin around the date. Most watches don't do dates properly, and as a half-blind person, I love the living crap out of the combat sub's date. The combat sub has a flat raised sapphire crystal. I think dome crystals are sexy, but given a choice, I prefer a flat crystal because you can read them much better at extreme angles. And this is especially true of the combat sub. I can't detect any type of color tint on either the edge or front of the crystal. This suggests to me that the watch isn't AR coated. The combat sub doesn't need AR coating anyway, as the crystal is flat and there is very little depth to the dial. The crown is signed and big and grippy. The stem is not the skimpy rod you see on watches in this price range. This is what a real stem looks like. It is thick and meaty with no wobble. The crown has really good pop and is relatively responsive. The date really snaps into place when setting it as well. The bezel uses an aluminum insert. Aluminum inserts tend to dent and scratch fairly easily. The bezel itself is wafer thin. If you attempt to turn it as if it were a normal watch, not only will it require a lot of work, but your fingers will become chafed. To turn it properly, you must place fingers on opposite sides of the insert and then push in. And when you do this, you'll hear this horrible grating sound. That's the sound of the bezel turning. One thing I really don't like about the bezel is what I will call, for lack of better words, the nub. That's this little bump here. The bump is slightly uncomfortable when turning the bezel and is a mild annoyance. The combat sub has a 60-click unidirectional bezel. Most people, including myself, prefer 120 clicks. But 60 clicks I think are good enough, and I think you'll live. Overall, the bezel is pretty uncomfortable and awkward to turn, even when you're turning it the optimal way. This is the main reason why I sold my original Combat Sub. The Combat Sub's engineers bent over backwards, making this watch thin in every respect. This watch is only 10.5 millimeters in thickness, and it wears like a thin quartz diver. The great news about the case is that Invicta added back drill lug holes. My first Invicta didn't have this feature. The lugs of the case are nicely curved, which aids in wrist conformance. The case is brushed on the front and polished on the sides. The brushing was done using an interesting radial pattern, and I like it. I'm okay with the quality of the polishing on the sides of the case. I just don't like the fact that they polished it. This is the Combat Sub. How is one expected to engage in naval warfare with a blingy diver? I could picture Jacques Cousteau cruising around in his Calypso searching for yet-to-be-explored squid sporting a blingy diver watch. But the Combat Sub was made for battle-hardened sailors and combat marines ready to combat the enemy at any time. There's no room for flair in a military watch, I'm sorry. There's a sharp edge here on the point of the lug. However, I doubt if you or someone else will ever feel the sharp edge when you wear the watch, as the end link blocks the sharp edge. I wore my original Combat Sub on a NATO, and I had cut myself twice on the Combat Sub's sharp lug ends while putting the watch on my wrist. I never felt the sharp edge while wearing the watch. I don't think the sharp edge is a big deal, but I think Invicta should definitely blunt it.
Here is the back of the case. It's okay.
The Combat Sub's bracelet is a mixed bag. Like the case, the bracelet is brushed on the top and polished on the sides. The end links are solid, but the links unfortunately use push pins. At $400, I don't demand to have screw pins, but it's something I really like to see. I hate push pins. I'm bad at banging them in and banging them out. The Combat Sub's push pins were especially tight, and it took me nearly an hour to size the watch. Fortunately, I didn't damage or break the push pins or the watch, but I did somehow manage to destroy my watch sizing mallet. This is the 21st century. We shouldn't be taking hammers to watches anymore. The process is just stupid. Does the Combat Sub's bracelet seem to naturally blend into the case to you? It sure doesn't look that way to me. I think Invicta did a pretty piss-poor job of integration here. The Combat Sub uses movable end links. Notice how the end link on my Citizen Courageous is fixed, whereas the end link in the Combat Sub pivots. The movable end link enables the Combat Sub to conform to the wrist better. The bracelet links are not terribly flexible, and I think this bracelet would wear a lot better if the links were more flexible. The bracelet links are 3.5 millimeters in thickness, which is on the thin side in keeping with the thinness of the case. The sides of the links are not rough, but I wouldn't say they're smooth either. The bracelet does not have a great deal of taper. It starts out at 22 millimeters, tapers down to 20 millimeters, and is 21.5 millimeters at the clasp. The finishing of the Combat Sub's bracelet, I'd say, is mediocre for this price point. The biggest surprise of the bracelet was how well Invicta did the clasp. And Invicta makes some god-awful clasps in its main product line. I bitch and moan interminably in my videos about fold-over style clasps like this, which I call ice scraper clasps. But Invicta really got the Combat Sub's clasp right. The clasp has a nicely done logo. The clasp's scissor is made of thick metal. The metal of the clasp is thin, yet thick enough to be sturdy. The bracelet fits the links of the clasp perfectly. There is no gap between the links and the clasp whatsoever. The lever is often loose and wobbly in fold-over style clasps. Not true of the Combat Sub, at least not in this Combat Sub. The lever is firm and snaps in tight. The Combat Sub's clasp is easily the best I reviewed all year. My only complaint about the clasp is that it's overly difficult to get my thumb in order to open it. I forgive this because I understand that the engineers were aiming for a clasp that had very little bulk to it, and I appreciate this. Invicta has continued Glycine's tradition of confusing and misleading consumers about the movement used in the Combat Sub by calling it the GL0249. The first Combat Sub I bought probably was using an ETA 2824. Invicta probably changed their movement supplier from ETA to Solida. Solida is a well-known maker of Swiss movements. The Combat Sub I'm currently reviewing is probably using some mystery meets Solida movement. The beauty of calling your movement the GL0249 is that you can basically slap whatever off-the-shelf movement you damn well please into the watch, thus keeping everyone else in the dark, including me. Notice in Invicta's movement specification under Swiss made, they say no. I wouldn't assume this is a typo. The Combat Sub's diameter of 42 millimeters is pretty normal for a modern dive watch. The lug-to-lug is slightly big at 49.5 millimeters, but that's not an issue with this watch, as the watch's curved lugs and movable end links allow the watch to conform to your wrist very nicely. I really like low-profile clasps like the Combat Sub has, and it makes the watch a lot more wearable. The negative features of the Combat Sub's bracelet outweigh its positive features. The Combat Sub's bracelet doesn't feel especially smooth on the wrist, and that, combined with the lack of flexibility in the links, makes the bracelet feel somewhat off-putting and cheap. The bracelet is 22 millimeters, which wouldn't ordinarily be a big deal, but 22 millimeters of not terribly comfortable bracelet that only tapers down to 20 millimeters is not exactly a recipe for watch bliss. I reviewed an Imitation Seiko tuner earlier this year with a solar quartz movement for $220. This was altogether a very well-made watch with a 22 millimeter bracelet that felt really good on the wrist and, with exception to the clasp, was superior to the Combat Sub's bracelet in every way. So I'm getting the sense that Invicta is cutting some corners with this bracelet. I was on the fence about whether to give the Combat Sub's bracelet a C- or a D+. Then I conducted my $100 Imitation Fake Omega test. I put my Imitation Fake Omega with its cheap-ass bracelet on my wrist, and the Imitation Omega felt better than the Combat Sub's bracelet. So I give the Combat Sub's bracelet a D+. According to the time grapher, this watch has a high beat movement that is running about 12 seconds fast a day. It's running a little fast for my comfort, but it's probably running well within specification for whatever movement it has. This is the Combat Sub's loom compared with the Citizen ProMaster directly after the loom has been charged. The Combat Sub's loom is readable after 2 hours. After 3 hours, it's a real challenge to read. The Combat Sub's loom is pretty poor. At least it is for this model. Is the Combat Sub a good value at $400? I'm not sure. It has a lot of great features. It's super readable. It's super cool looking. At least this one is. And it probably has some sort of entry-level Swiss movement. For me, the crappy bracelet and bezel make this watch an unhappy watch experience.